Good afternoon. It's Friday, August 28th. I'm Ari O'Sullivan, and this is IBA News broadcasting from Jerusalem. Public Security Minister Gilad Erdan met today with a group of bereaved parents of soldiers killed during the Second Lebanon War, as controversy surrounding the appointment of former IDF General Gal Hirsch as the nation's next police commissioner continues. The bereaved parents are strongly opposed to the decision. Erdan promised the families that he will thoroughly evaluate their objections to the appointment and expressed readiness to read 4 of the summary reports written about the war, which include criticism of Hirsch's conduct as commander of the forces in Lebanon during the time. Erdan also committed to meeting 2 of the report's authors, Reserve Generals Yoram Yair and Doron Almog, in order to hear their take on the issue. Following a nearly 90-minute meeting in Tel Aviv, the parents thanked the minister for his cooperation and decided to take down the protest tent, which they erected outside of his home last night. At the same time, the group is calling on the state comptroller and the Turco committee in charge of examining the appointments of senior civil servants to reconsider the decision. The committee has so far agreed to hear one of the bereaved fathers when he met to evaluate the appointment next week. The parents of fallen soldier Hadar Golden, who was killed last year during Operation Protective Edge and whose body has not been recovered, strongly rejected a new Hamas version of events that led to the seizing of their son's body. The family issued a statement last night slamming the Hamas claims as sheer and outrageous lie and accused the terror group of trying to slander the Israeli army. Their response followed a new report that aired last night on Al Jazeera Network, featuring a Hamas operative who said that the Israeli army mistakenly evacuated the body of a Palestinian fighter who was wearing an IDF uniform, thinking it was Golden's, before realizing that Golden was in fact missing. In the video, Hamas also denies that it violated the ceasefire on the day of Golden's abduction, insisting that the body was kidnapped 25 minutes before the ceasefire came into effect. The Al Jazeera report also showed a never-before-seen photograph of Gilad Shalit during the time of his captivity. In the picture, Shalit is seen sitting next to Hamas commander of the southern Gaza Strip, Mahmoud Abu Shalama, who was killed in Rafah during last year's war. Earlier this week, Hamas released another propaganda video allegedly showing renewed cross-border tunnel infrastructure in the Gaza Strip, as well as a range of military equipment and weapons used to target IDF forces. Iran has built an extension to its military facility in Parchin, which has long been suspected in the West of concealing its nuclear weapons program. This, according to an International Atomic Energy Agency report released yesterday, which noted that the IAEA recently observed through satellite imagery the presence of vehicles, equipment, and probable construction material at the site, warning that the activities which have taken place at this location since February 2012 are likely to have undermined the agency's ability to conduct effective verification. Last week, AP published the details of a previously undisclosed side deal between Iran and the IAEA for investigating Parchin. It allows Tehran to take its own environmental samples from the site and provide videos and photos to the agency, taking into account military concerns. Specifically, the IAEA believes Tehran may have experimented at Parchin with high explosive detonators for nuclear arms. State Department spokesman John Kirby was asked for the U.S. reaction to the IAEA report.
I think it's important to remember that when you're talking about a site like Parchin, you're talking about a conventional military site, not a nuclear site. So there wouldn't be any IAEA or other restrictions on new construction at that site, were they to occur.
U.S. President Barack Obama plans to reach out to American Jewish organizations in a webcast later today in an attempt to mollify concerns over the Iranian nuclear agreement. 18 of the 28 members of Congress identified as Jewish have declared a position on the Iran deal. 11 are in favor and 7 oppose. The webcast is being co-sponsored by the Jewish Federations of North America and the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations. The webcast is scheduled for 9:10 this evening, Israel time, with registration available on the Jewish Federation website. The two organizations sponsored a similar webcast on August 4th with Prime Minister Netanyahu. Later that day, Obama met in the White House with 22 Jewish leaders to address their concerns that the agreement poses a threat to Israel. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is scheduled to meet with the heads of the Jewish community in Florence later today as part of his 3-day visit to Italy. Upon his arrival yesterday, Netanyahu visited the World Expo in Milan. Speaking at the special event at the Israel Pavilion, the Prime Minister said that Israel wants to use its leading edge in agricultural innovation to help improve food production across Africa. He stressed that the state's technological and agricultural developments to improve the world are much stronger than all attempts to boycott and isolate the country. Well, joining us now in the studio to discuss current events is Amotz Asael, an analyst for the Wall Street Journal. Amotz, thanks for joining us.
How are you?
So, Amotz, Gal Hirsch, the appointment is very controversial, but it seems that this could be a classic case of the insiders against the outsiders. What do you think?
Well, in terms of the very vocal opposition with which this nomination has been met yesterday by former inspectors general and former deputy inspectors, some 30 of them, I believe, or 35. In this regard, you're right. This is about a guild trying to protect itself from the parachuting into its operation of a commander who comes from an entirely different ecosystem. However, having said that, there really are substantive problems with this nomination, but in those problems lie also the opportunities of this nomination, because there is no controversy and no one disputes the fact that Gal Hirsch is indeed a very original man, an unorthodox man, a very charismatic military commander, and also a brave warrior who's demonstrated his bravery repeatedly both in Lebanon and in the West Bank. Considering Israel police's situation and condition right now, after a slew of major league scandals involving even the deputy inspector general, the number 2 person in police who had to resign and then was arrested for sexual misconduct allegations. And as we know, about half of the general command of Israel police had to resign under either sexual misconduct allegations or other problems. This means that the organization is extremely ill, and this illness, its symptoms have been made plain to the public recently in the very preventable murder of a young woman in the gay parade in Jerusalem,
right.
and last year in the malfunctioning of the call center during the abduction of the 3 boys.
It's clear, Amotz, that the police have to be shaken up, but there's such a concentrated effort now to torpedo this whole deal. Could this be something that's moved against not Gal Hirsch, but Gilad Erdan, the minister?
It's clearly a factor in the puzzle, because Gilad Erdan is an up-and-coming leader within Likud. He's young, 45 or so, I believe, and as such, is an aspiring and a generally considered candidate for the succession come the day, along with various others in Likud. I don't think that any of them is actually actively trying to torpedo this nomination, because it really is a unique nomination in its own right. But you're right in that Gilad Erdan's future lies on the success or the failure of this nomination, and time will tell how it will transpire.
Amotz, let's move to Iran. It seems increasingly clear now that President Obama, is getting close to the not having to use his overriding veto. So is there any point in Israel continuing to oppose the deal?
Well, from where Netanyahu has arrived, he has no choice but to at least go through the motions, and it's no embarrassment to run the battle through its course and reach its anticlimax, which we may now be fast approaching. But the question is what happens the following day. And the following day, if indeed this deal is ratified by Washington and sanctions are lifted, then the question is what happens the following day. In my view, obviously Israel, and there's a consensus about that in Israel, the struggle against this specific nuclear program that Iran has masterminded and promoted, that will of course have to continue. But otherwise, Israel will have to watch very closely how Iran manages its affairs generally and where it proceeds socially and economically. Within that very big enigma and very big mystery might lie the future, which will be much more acceptable for Israel, a reinvented Iran. It's up to the Iranians, and we have to very patiently watch that without trying to affect directly Iran's future.
You know, there's a few oddities emerging now, like we saw earlier today, that Iran will inspect itself. And yet it's not convincing the congressman to vote against it. I mean, is there anything that can be said or done to make the congressman vote against the deal? Or is it too late?
My impression from what we're witnessing is that most of the teetering congressmen have made up their minds, and that this particular revelation is not changing their minds. It is strange from my viewpoint, and I think all Israelis find this entire negotiation dynamic very alarming, and it's part of a broader deep misunderstanding of the Middle East that this particular Obama administration has displayed, often at our expense.
Amot, you're also an economic analyst with a huge background in economy. Looking at what's happened with the stock markets this week, do you think that it's over now, we're on a rebound, or what?
Well, in terms of what is beyond China, the rest of the world, that is, what initially seemed when their markets collapsed, namely that this would trigger a global crisis, I think in this regard there is the cause for calm. We can say for now that, as many have suspected from the onset, this is not about the world. This is about China, and as economic crises go, this is for now confined to the financial markets rather than to the real economy. There is no equivalent right now. We haven't seen, and we're not about to see any equivalent of what we saw in 2008 with pillars of Wall Street's financial institutions collapsing. That's not what this is about. This is about how China manages its own economy. And in this regard, we can say that recent years' phenomenon of authoritarian capitalism that seemed for a while to be extremely successful is now ill, and probably much more seriously than the Chinese themselves are prepared to admit.
So what do you think? Buy, sell, ride it out?
I won't say that on the air.
Okay. Amot of the Wall Street Journal, thanks for joining IBA
Thank you.
News. Is enough being done to combat BDS? That's the question IBA's Ellie Wogelenter asked Dan Diker, Foreign Policy Fellow at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs and author of Unmasking BDS, Radical Roots, Extremist Ends.
The challenge in combating BDS is to centralize and organize and structure a united response, with Israel taking the lead in many cases. I think one of the major problems we face is that Israel's act needs to really get itself together and take a much more of a leading role in the global fight against delegitimization, which in many cases, if not most cases today, is connected to anti-Semitism. It's anti-Semitism against the collective Jewish personality, which is Israel. And it hides behind the politically correct nomenclature of delegitimization. That is, in most cases, it's absolute nonsense. And Israel must take the lead in fighting it, because Israel is the target. And here the target has to become the counter. It has to become the defender, and it also has to become the counter-assaulter against the BDSers. It's very important, because the American and European and global Jewish communities are looking to Israel to see what Israel's going to do against BDS. It's not enough that there are all of these decentralized partisan attempts to chip away at BDS.
Are they not legitimate efforts?
All of the efforts to fight BDS are blessed, legitimate, and should be continued. But they have to be organized and structured. Now, there are those that say it takes a network to defeat a network, and the BDS delegitimization network is definitely a network. And in many cases, they're decentralized now, with Iran being completely legitimized by the West. It becomes now a key player with greater legitimacy in the international delegitimization campaign. I mean, that is what the meaning of doing this peace deal with Iran is, making them the crown jewel of the global delegitimization campaign and have it be legitimized. So there's a further challenge there. But Israel has to play a much sharper leading role. It doesn't matter how many millions of dollars are being invested into the counter-BDS campaign if those dollars aren't efficiently used, and there's not a force multiplier of those dollars, which means centralization of effort in many cases and not duplication of effort, then we are going to come up short in the fight against delegitimization.
But it will take millions of dollars to fight BDS, because they have millions of dollars that they're using in their campaign.
BDS is a national security threat against Israel and the Jewish people. It is not a pain in the neck. It is nothing less than a national security threat that should be dealt with by Israel's security and intelligence organs, as well as in concert with or together with Israel's friends and family and supporters around the world. And it takes millions of dollars. As any national security threat requires, it takes tens of millions of dollars a year in order to snuff out this raging fire of what Alan Dershowitz, professor of Harvard Law, called the immoral fire. And it takes the moral fire to defeat the immoral fire. And we've got to, turn up the flames of the moral fire in order to consume those enemies that are using terrorism off the military battlefield. They're using it on the economic battlefield, on the cultural battlefield. They're using it in the legal battlefields. They're using it in every single arena, in addition to conventional terror. And it's no different and it's no less dangerous than conventional terror. And that takes millions and millions of dollars to fight. But it takes coordination. Organization, coordination, and structure. That is the key.
Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi held talks this week with his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin in Moscow during his third visit to Russia since taking office last year. The two nations pledged to boost further bilateral cooperation in economic matters, as well as the fight against Islamist extremists and the political situation in the Middle East. They also voiced mutual support for the establishment of a Palestinian state with its future capital in East Jerusalem. Putin also announced the construction of a nuclear power plant in Egypt. He said it will be based on Russian technologies. Since the imposition of the Western sanctions on Russia over the Ukrainian conflict, Moscow has been cultivating ties with former Soviet-era allies, including Cairo. More than a year after the end of Operation Protective Edge, the hotel industry is yet to fully recover from the decrease in visitors to the country. According to reports released this week, the Israel Hotel Association registered only an 8% increase in bookings this past July, compared to the same month last year during the Gaza war, and 17% below July of 2013. The CEO of Prima Hotels chain, Avi Dor, discussed the situation with Arutz Sheva.
We are still fighting to recover from last year. It didn't stop yet for us. We still have problems of filling up the hotels with tourists mostly, due to the fact that all the situation is still on the news. We have still issues in Jerusalem, in the Middle East.
What can be done? Is it mainly about marketing, telling the real story about what goes on here?
Yes, it's mainly about marketing, ongoing marketing, because this is the only way that we could go out from this situation. If we'll go fast with the budget that already authorized by the tourist ministry, we could have the effect immediately.
And also the economic crisis throughout the world in terms of the target audience themselves. That's also, of course, influences on what goes on and how people can afford coming to Israel and spending in the hotels.
Yes. Due to the fact that we are having a very strong shekel, Israeli shekel, we looked like a very expensive country, a matter of tourism. And what happens in Russia economically, it's affecting us also as part of their sanction, the American sanction over there.
Now, it's also important to note that once we see sometime the numbers of the stats of tourism ministry of more people coming into the state of Israel, but that does not actually mean that there are more people staying in the hotels.
True. The entrance of tourists, or what the term tourist to Israel, is not always coming to the hotels. Sometimes they are staying at friends' houses or their own houses here in Israel, or they're coming for one-day tour, or what happens in the last years, that's the average spend days in Israel went down in more than 30%.
In financial news, the shekel today ended the trading week by gaining strength against all major foreign currencies. And due to the closure of the stock market on Fridays, here's a look at the closing numbers for the week. The weather people at IBA tell us that there will be no change in the weather over the weekend, but there might be a slight chance of rain on Sunday. Here's a look at the expected highs and lows at home and abroad for the next 24 hours. That's our broadcast for today. Please join us again tomorrow when Aaron Viner will be at this desk to bring you the latest news from Israel. Until then, I'm Aryeh O'Sullivan wishing you a great evening and Shabbat Shalom from Jerusalem.